3 weeks later, Karen stood in her kitchen, staring at the certified letter in her trembling hands. The words, class action lawsuit, seemed to blur and refocus as she read them for the third time. 17 families had banded together, citing harassment, property damage from her inspections, and emotional distress. Her phone buzzed with a text from her husband. Saw the news article online. We need to talk when I get back. News article? Karen frantically opened her laptop and searched her name. There it was, on the front page of the local newspaper's website. How a president's reign of terror ends in lawsuit. The accompanying photo showed her measuring Mrs. Patterson's roses with a protractor, her face twisted in concentration. The doorbell rang, and Karen's heart sank as she saw Miguel Rodriguez standing on her porch, but this time he wasn't alone. A woman in a sharp suit stood beside him, briefcase in hand. Mrs. Whitmore, Miguel said, his voice surprisingly gentle. This is Sarah Chen, my attorney. We'd like to discuss a settlement. Karen's perfectly controlled world began to crack. A settlement? I was protecting property values. I was maintaining standards. Sarah stepped forward, her expression professional but not unkind. Mrs. Whitmore, my clients aren't seeking revenge. They're seeking peace. Your enthusiasm for enforcement has crossed several legal lines. As they sat in Karen's spotless living room, Sarah laid out the damages. The Hendersons had security footage of Karen attempting to remove their solar panels with a crowbar. Mrs. Patterson had medical records showing stress-related symptoms after Karen had pruned her prize-winning roses without permission. The list went on. We're prepared to settle for community service and your resignation from the HOA board, Sarah continued. In exchange, we won't pursue the criminal charges for trespassing and property damage. Karen felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine fear. Not the manufactured urgency of covenant violations, but the real possibility of losing everything she'd built. Her reputation, her position, her sense of purpose. I need time to think, she whispered. That evening, Karen walked through Sunset Creek Estates for the first time in months without her clipboard. She noticed things she'd missed. The way Mr. Kim had created a small memorial garden for his late wife. How the Johnson kids had chalked a hopscotch court that brought joy to the neighborhood children. The pride in Miguel's eyes as he watered the garden gnome his granddaughter had given him. When she returned home, Karen found her husband's car in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she could see him sitting at their table, another set of papers spread in front of him. These weren't HOA documents. They were divorce papers. Karen stood in her doorway, ruler still in her hand from habit, and realized that in her quest to control everything around her, she'd lost control of the things that truly mattered. The question now was whether it was too late to find her way back. Inside the house, her husband looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. We need to talk, Karen, about everything. But as Karen set down her ruler for what might be the last time, she noticed something odd through the window, a moving truck parked outside the Henderson house, and a for sale sign being planted in Miguel's front yard. The neighborhood she'd fought so hard to preserve was dissolving around her, and Karen couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much larger than a simple lawsuit. Karen Whitmore stood in her pristine driveway at 6:47 a.m., measuring her neighbor's grass with a metal ruler while wearing a full business suit and pearls. The sprinklers had created a small puddle near the curb, and she was documenting it with the dedication of a crime scene investigator, complete with a clipboard and digital camera. Excuse me, ma'am? The mailman approached cautiously, having witnessed Karen's morning ritual for 3 weeks straight. Are you measuring the lawn? Karen straightened, her perfectly coiffed blonde bob not moving an inch despite the morning breeze. The HOA covenant clearly states that grass height cannot exceed 2 3/4 inches. Mr. Rodriguez's Kentucky bluegrass is currently sitting at 3.1 inches. She tapped her ruler against the clipboard with the precision of a metronome. That's a clear violation. The mailman backed away slowly, but Karen wasn't finished. She marched to the modest ranch house next door and hammered on the door with the intensity of a SWAT team raid. When Miguel Rodriguez answered, still in his pajamas and holding a cup of coffee, Karen thrust her clipboard at his chest. Mr. Rodriguez, this is your final warning. Your grass is in violation. Your mailbox is painted the wrong shade of beige, and your garden gnome is clearly visible from the street. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had never been questioned in her life. I'm calling an emergency HOA meeting for tonight. 7 o'clock sharp. Miguel blinked, steam still rising from his coffee. Karen, it's not even 7 in the morning. Mrs. Whitmore, she corrected, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. And punctuality is a virtue, Mr. Rodriguez. Perhaps if you maintained your property with the same dedication you showed to sleeping in, we wouldn't have these issues. By noon, Karen had issued 17 more violations throughout Sunset Creek Estates. Mrs. Patterson's rose bushes were aggressively pink. The Johnson family's basketball hoop was lowering property values. And don't even get her started on the Hendersons' choice to install solar panels without her written approval. Karen sat in her home office, surrounded by filing cabinets labeled by year and violation type, feeling the familiar rush of purpose that came with maintaining order. Her husband had left that morning for another business trip, the 4th one this month. But Karen barely noticed. She had work to do. The emergency HOA meeting that evening was standing room only, which Karen took as validation of her efforts. She stood at the podium in the community center, her laser pointer ready and a PowerPoint presentation, titled Preserving Our Community's Excellence, queued up on her laptop. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice echoing through the packed room. We are at a crossroads. We can either maintain the standards that make Sunset Creek Estates the premier neighborhood in the city, or we can let it deteriorate into chaos. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Karen clicked to her first slide, a photo of Miguel's garden gnome, circled in red marker. This, she announced dramatically, is what happens when we become complacent.